At 7:06 a.m. on payroll day, the CEO called me 12 times because $4.8 million in client payments were locked behind a system nobody else could access. They had pushed me out 2 days earlier, and nobody had thought to ask why I was the only one who knew the password. They called me replaceable, removed me from meetings, and treated a company-wide payment system like it was just another spreadsheet. But when the system froze, they discovered the password was the smallest part of what I knew, and the backup they trusted had never actually worked. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. For 6 years, I worked as Treasury Operations Manager for a logistics company called Meridian Freight Solutions. We moved equipment, medical supplies, construction materials, and temperature-controlled goods across the country. The company looked large from the outside. For regional offices, more than 900 employees. Annual revenue just above $140 million. But inside, it was held together by a handful of systems, a small group of exhausted people, and a lot of confidence from executives who never had to use those systems themselves. My job was managing the money moving through the company. Client payments, carrier payments, fuel card reconciliation, payroll funding, bank files, vendor approvals. Every weekday before 8 a.m., I reviewed outgoing payment batches, verified client remittances, checked exception reports, and made sure the cash position matched what the company believed it had. It was not glamorous. But if I made a mistake, drivers did not get paid. If a payment file failed, fuel cards could be shut off. If a client credit was entered incorrectly, a shipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars might not leave a terminal. Most people did not understand the work. They only noticed when it stopped. My manager was Daniel Crowe, the new chief financial officer. Daniel had joined Meridian 9 months earlier from a private equity-backed company where, according to him, finance ran with discipline. He used that phrase constantly. With discipline. What he meant was that he liked dashboards, executive summaries, and anything that could fit into a presentation slide. He hated operational questions. He hated controls he did not understand. And he had a habit that made every meeting worse. Whenever someone explained a risk, Daniel would turn his expensive pen between his fingers, smile slightly, and say, "That sounds like a people problem, not a process problem." It was his way of making real work sound like incompetence. The more complicated an issue was, the more certain Daniel became that someone below him had made it complicated on purpose. When he arrived, he started asking why I had access to so many systems. Why I approved bank files. Why I had the emergency administrator credential for the payment portal. Why I was the only person authorized to reset the multi-factor authentication device linked to our payment account. The answer was simple. Because I had built the process after the person before me left during an audit failure. The company had never invested in a proper treasury team. They had invested in me. Then they forgot why. Daniel did not see years of controls, checklists, test files, bank relationships, and reconciliations. He saw one woman with knowledge that made him uncomfortable. So he decided the knowledge was the problem. On a Wednesday afternoon at 4:59 p.m., he called me into a meeting with Human Resources. He told me Meridian was modernizing its finance structure. Then he said my position was being eliminated. No warning. No transition plan. No replacement named. Just a separation agreement, a final paycheck calculation, and a box waiting outside my office. I asked one question. Who is responsible for the payment portal administration after today? Daniel smiled and turned his pen. That sounds like a people problem, not a process problem. I looked at him for a moment. Then I signed nothing. Because Daniel had no idea what he had just removed from the company. And he had even less idea what would happen at 7:06 a.m. Friday. The password was never the real issue. I had given Meridian a full access transfer checklist 3 months earlier, including 2 backup administrators, bank authorization forms, and a tested recovery process. But Daniel rejected it as unnecessary bureaucracy. What he did not know was that the backup credentials he assumed existed had expired, and the only person who could confirm that was the one he had just walked out. Daniel made his first visible mistake before I had even cleared out my desk. At 5:18 p.m., He sent a company-wide finance email. The subject line was, "Improving accountability and reducing single-point dependency." I was copied. Of course I was. The email announced that Meridian was streamlining Treasury operations and moving payment oversight into a new centralized finance model. It said no individual employee should hold unique institutional knowledge that could slow the organization down. That sentence was almost impressive. Not because it was wise. Because Daniel had written it while eliminating the one person who had repeatedly asked for cross-training, backup access, and a documented recovery plan. He made the company's biggest weakness sound like my personal failure. Then he assigned my work to 3 people. A payroll supervisor named Ethan would manage employee funding files. A senior accountant named Marisol would reconcile client payments. And Daniel's new financial analyst, Grant, would coordinate system access. Grant was 24. He had started at Meridian 6 weeks earlier. He had a degree in finance and a clean desk full of color-coded notebooks. He was polite. He was intelligent. And he had never spoken to our bank, processed a payment batch, reviewed a notcha file, or logged into the Treasury portal. But Daniel liked him. Grant said things like, "That makes sense," when Daniel spoke. That was apparently enough to make him the new access coordinator for a system that moved millions of dollars every week. At 5:26 p.m., Grant appeared in my doorway. He held a printed copy of Daniel's email. "Hi," he said. "Daniel asked me to get everything from you." I looked at the paper. Everything. The logins, workflows, passwords, reports. Just whatever I need. I nodded. "Do you have the access transfer checklist?" He looked confused. "What checklist?" "The one I sent Daniel in April. Again in June. And again after the external audit in August." Grant checked his phone. "No, I don't think so." That was when I understood Daniel had not merely ignored the process. He had hidden it. I opened my computer and pulled up the checklist. It was 22 pages. Not because I liked paperwork. Because Treasury access cannot be transferred through a casual conversation beside someone's desk. The checklist included dual approval requirements, bank contacts, encrypted credential storage, MFA enrollment, payment cutoff times, approval limits, emergency escalation procedures, reconciliation timing, and the exact steps required to restore access if a designated administrator left. Grant stared at it. "This is a lot." "Yes," I said. "Can you just tell me the important parts?" "The important part is that this needs to be completed before I leave." He looked uncomfortable. "Daniel said you were done today." "I am. But Meridian has payment files scheduled Friday morning. Those files require portal access." Grant walked back to Daniel's office. I could hear them through the glass. Grant said something about the checklist. Daniel gave a short laugh. Then he said, loudly enough for half the floor to hear, "We are not holding up an organizational change because someone made a password sound dramatic." A few people looked down at their screens. Nobody laughed. That should have told him something. At 5:41 p.m., Daniel came into my office. He closed the door. "We don't need a 22-page document," he said. "We need a controlled transfer. You are making this harder than it needs to be." "No. I am trying to make sure payroll and carrier payments go out Friday." He sat across from me. "Do you know what the problem is, Simone?" I had heard that opening before. It meant Daniel had already decided what the problem was. "You believe you are indispensable." I kept my expression calm. "I believe the process has dependencies that need to be transferred." There it is. Process. Dependencies. Controls. He shook his head. "You have turned basic finance work into a private kingdom." I almost felt sorry for him. Not because he was wrong about me. Because he had no idea how wrong he was about the work. "Daniel," I said, "I asked for a backup administrator 6 months ago. I asked for cross-training. I asked for an annual recovery test. All 3 requests were declined." He turned his pen between his fingers. "That sounds like a people problem." I looked at the clock. 5:48 p.m. Then I did exactly what a professional should do. I emailed him the checklist. I copied Human Resources, Marisol, Ethan, Grant, the controller, and our internal compliance officer. I wrote one sentence at the top. Please note that Meridian's Treasury portal requires completion of the attached transfer controls before any new administrator can access or release payment files. Then I added a second sentence. Friday's payment cycle includes payroll funding, carrier settlements, and client refund activity with an estimated value of $4.8 million. Daniel replied at 5:56 p.m. Received. Grant will handle it. That was his first written mistake. Because Grant will handle it did not mean Grant understood it. It meant Daniel had been warned and chose to move forward anyway. At 6:07 p.m., security walked me to the lobby. They collected my badge. They collected my laptop. They collected the company phone that held the Treasury portal's multi-factor authentication app. The app had never been transferred. No new administrator had been enrolled. No backup token had been activated. And the payment cycle began at 6:30 a.m. Friday. I went home. I cooked dinner. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. Then, at 7:06 a.m. Friday, it started ringing. The first call was Ethan. Then Marisol. Then Grant. Then Daniel. Then the controller. 5 calls in 3 minutes. I let them ring. Not because I wanted them to suffer. Because I was no longer an employee, and every one of those people had received the same checklist Daniel had dismissed. At 7:14 a.m., I received a text from Grant. Hi, Simone. Sorry to bother you. Can you please call me? We cannot access the payment portal. I read it. Then I set the phone down. At 7:19 a.m., Daniel left a voicemail. His tone had changed. Simone, this is urgent. There appears to be an access issue. Please call me immediately. An access issue. That was what he called it. Not the result of refusing a controlled transfer. Not the result of removing the only active administrator and confiscating the authentication device. An access issue. At 7:28 a.m., the controller emailed the finance group. Payment portal login attempts are locked. Please confirm whether the Treasury access transition was completed. Grant replied 7 minutes later. Still working on it. That was the first satisfying turn. Because suddenly, the password was not a strange detail I had been exaggerating. It was a measurable problem. A locked portal. A payment deadline. A record of warnings. And a CFO who had told everyone the process would be simpler without me. But the lockout was only the beginning. At 8:03 a.m., Meridian's payroll processor sent an automated alert. The funding file had not been released. If the file was not approved by 10 a.m., 914 employees would not receive direct deposits on time. Drivers, dispatchers, warehouse workers, customer service staff, people who had nothing to do with Daniel's ego. That mattered to me. So I did not ignore the calls forever. At 8:10 a.m., I sent a single email. To Daniel, the controller, human resources, compliance, and legal. I understand there is a Treasury portal access issue. I am no longer employed by Meridian and cannot access or operate company systems. Please refer to the access transfer checklist sent at 5:48 p.m. Wednesday. I am available to discuss a paid emergency consulting engagement through written agreement if Meridian requires my assistance. No drama. No threat. No argument. Just a boundary. Daniel called 30 seconds later. This time I answered. Simone, he said, we need you to give Grant the password. I do not have a password I can provide over the phone. What does that mean? The portal uses individual identities, multi-factor authentication, and device registration. The credentials cannot be transferred correctly by sharing a password. He was quiet. Then he said, fine. Tell us how to reset it. The reset requires the authorized administrator, bank verification, and the emergency recovery documentation. Where is that documentation? It is in the checklist. I mean the actual recovery information. It is stored in the company's encrypted credential vault. Who has access to that? The emergency administrator. He paused. And that's you. It was me. Daniel took a breath. Then give us access. I cannot. My account was disabled when I was terminated. His voice rose slightly. You're telling me the company cannot access its own payment system? I'm telling you the company chose not to complete the transfer process before disabling the person authorized to access it. He said nothing. Then he asked, what do you need to fix this? That was the question he should have asked on Wednesday. But now the stakes were different. At 8:27 a.m., the payroll deadline was 93 minutes away. At 8:31 a.m., a carrier settlement batch was due. If it did not release, 126 contracted drivers would not be paid for completed deliveries. And at 9 a.m., a major client's automatic debit would attempt to settle against an account Meridian could not reconcile manually. Daniel was finally seeing the system, not as a people problem, as a chain of obligations. I told him exactly what I would need. I signed consulting agreement, indemnification for work performed after termination, confirmation that I am authorized to coordinate with the bank, and written authority from legal and the controller. Daniel did not like it. I could hear it in the silence. But he had no alternatives. At 8:42 a.m., legal sent the agreement. It was rushed. It was missing 2 protections. I marked them. They sent a revised version at 8:54 a.m. I signed at 8:57 a.m. Then I drove to the bank. Not Meridian's office. The bank. Because what Daniel still did not understand was that getting back into the portal would not solve the whole problem. The payment file had been opened during Grant's failed access attempts. The bank's fraud monitoring system had flagged it. And if the bank froze the account permanently, the company would not just miss payroll. It would trigger a review of every outgoing payment instruction for the last 30 days. That was when the situation stopped being embarrassing and became dangerous. If you've ever been underestimated at work, you already know where this is going. Subscribe, because the ending is better than you think. At 9:14 a.m., I was on a call with the bank's Treasury security team. Daniel was there. The controller was there. Grant was there, silent. The bank representative asked a basic question. Who is the authorized emergency administrator for Meridian Freight Solutions? Daniel answered first. Simone was, but we are transitioning access. The representative asked, has the transition been completed and verified? Daniel looked at me. I answered, no. The bank representative paused. Then the account cannot be unlocked through an ordinary password reset. We will need to conduct a full identity and authorization review. Daniel's face changed. How long will that take? Typically 1 to 2 business days, she said. Daniel went pale. 1 to 2 days? We have payroll today. I understand, she said. But we cannot override fraud controls without validated authorization. At 9:22 a.m., Daniel muted his microphone. Then he said to me, you need to tell them this is a routine access change. I looked directly at him through the screen. It is not a routine access change. Simone. The company terminated the active administrator without completing the documented transfer process. The bank needs the truth. He stared at me. And for the first time, I saw him understand that pressure would not work. I had no job to protect. No manager to impress. No reason to soften facts that he had ignored in writing. The bank began the emergency review. But that was not fast enough. At 9:31 a.m., Ethan said the payroll processor needed funding authorization by 10 a.m. or the direct deposit window would close. The controller asked whether payroll could be released manually. Ethan explained that the payroll processor would accept a wire. But Meridian needed 2 authorized approvers. One was Daniel. The other had been me. My authority had been revoked. And because Daniel had not completed the updated bank signature forms, there was no active second approver. That was the second problem. The one nobody had checked. The password was a lock. But the bank authorization was the key. And Daniel had fired the person holding both. By 9:43 a.m., the controller was calling the CEO. By 9:47 a.m., the CEO was calling Daniel. By 9:51 a.m., Daniel was calling me again. This time he did not sound angry. He sounded scared. Can you come to the office? I am at the bank resolving the account review. We need payroll. I know. Can you authorize the wire? Not without written reauthorization from Meridian and the bank. Then what do we do? I looked at the timeline. 9 minutes. Have the CEO sign the emergency bank authorization form. Have legal send it to the bank with an indemnity letter. Have the controller confirm the exact payroll funding amount. And have Ethan prepare the wire instructions. Daniel said, can you just tell them that? I just did. But Daniel did not know how to make the pieces move. That was the point of no return. He had spent months believing my value was a password. Now he was hearing that the work involved bank procedures, controls, timing, legal authority, and people who had to trust that the person calling them knew what she was doing. He did not. And at 9:58 a.m., he made the mistake that finally ended him. But what happened at 9 a.m. the next morning is the part nobody saw coming, and it started with one email Daniel never should have sent. He was trying to blame the lockout on me and prove I had deliberately withheld access. Instead, he copied the board, legal, and the bank on a claim that contradicted his own written orders and exposed that he had ignored every safeguard before firing the one person who understood the system. We made the 10 a.m. payroll funding deadline. Barely. At 9:59 a.m., the CEO's emergency authorization reached the bank. At 10:01 a.m., the bank accepted it for manual review. At 10:04 a.m., the wire was released under temporary dual controls. The direct deposits went through. The employees got paid. That was the outcome I wanted. No driver deserved to miss rent because Daniel had mistaken competence for inconvenience. No warehouse employee should have a bounced mortgage payment because the CFO was embarrassed by a process he did not understand. But the emergency wire did not solve everything. The carrier settlement file was still frozen. The client remittance batch was still locked. The Treasury portal was still under fraud review. And Daniel had spent the morning looking worse with every call. By noon, he had stopped speaking in meetings unless someone asked him a direct question. By 2 p.m., the CEO had asked legal for a full timeline. By 4:40 p.m., I had sent them one. Not an opinion. A timeline. April 3rd, I requested backup administrator enrollment. April 18th, Daniel declined, calling it unnecessary overlap. June 11th, I submitted the annual access transfer checklist. June 14th, Daniel replied that the existing setup was sufficient for current scale. August 22nd, external audit recommended formal backup access testing. September 1st, I requested a recovery test. September 3rd, Daniel denied the request. Wednesday 5:48 p.m., I sent the final access transfer checklist before termination. Wednesday 5:56 p.m., Daniel replied, received. Grant will handle it. Thursday 6:07 p.m., my company phone and authentication device were collected. Friday 7:06 a.m., Meridian's Treasury portal lockout began. The timeline was simple. That was what made it devastating. Nobody needed to guess what happened. Daniel had been warned. Repeatedly. He had not failed because a former employee trapped the company behind a secret password. He had failed because he treated a documented financial control like a personal inconvenience. The portal remained locked through the weekend. The bank would not restore access until it had completed the review. So Meridian had to operate under emergency manual controls. Every payment over $25,000 required the CEO, controller, and bank representative to confirm it by phone. Every carrier settlement required a manual approval. Every client payment had to be reconciled through reports exported from a separate accounting system. The company could function, but not smoothly, not cheaply, not with the confidence Daniel promised. On Monday morning, I arrived at Meridian under my consulting agreement. I had a temporary badge, a conference room, a rate that was 4 times my previous hourly equivalent, and a written scope that said I would advise on treasury recovery, system access restoration, and continuity controls. Daniel was still technically the CFO, but he was not allowed to direct the recovery work. The CEO had reassigned that responsibility to the controller and legal. Daniel sat through the meetings anyway. He tried to use the language he always used. Let's not overreact. Let's keep this high level. Let's move with discipline. But nobody responded to it anymore, because the room had seen what his discipline looked like. At 10:12 a.m., the bank's fraud review manager joined our call. She asked for the signed administrator transfer records. Daniel could not provide them. She asked for the latest documented recovery test. No one could provide it. She asked who had authorized Grant's administrator assignment. Daniel looked at Grant. Grant looked down. Then I spoke. Grant was not assigned administrator access. He was told to coordinate the transition. The formal enrollment process was never completed. The bank manager asked, "Why was the prior administrator's access terminated first?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. The controller answered, "That decision is under internal review." That was a polite way of saying nobody was going to defend him. At 11:30 a.m., legal asked me to review Daniel's email from the morning of the lockout, the one he had sent at 9 a.m. I had not seen it yet. The subject line was, "Urgent, former employee withholding critical access." Daniel had written that I had failed to provide necessary credentials and administrative access before departing. He said my conduct was creating material disruption to Meridian's payment operations. Then he copied the CEO, legal, the board liaison, human resources, the controller, and, because Daniel still did not understand how email worked, the bank relationship manager. The bank relationship manager had replied at 9:18 a.m. She attached my April request for backup administrator enrollment, my June access transfer checklist, the external auditor's recommendation, and Daniel's written responses declining each one. Her message was 7 lines long. Based on the attached correspondence, the former employee appears to have provided repeated continuity recommendations. Meridian's current access issue appears related to an incomplete internal transition, not withheld credentials. Please direct future communications through your legal team. I read it once. Then I set the email down. That was Daniel's ending. Not because I shouted. Not because I exposed him publicly. Because he tried to blame the person he had pushed out, and the evidence was already sitting in everyone's inbox. At 1:05 p.m., the CEO asked Daniel to leave the recovery meeting. At 3:30 p.m., Human Resources scheduled a separate conversation with him. At 5:15 p.m., the company announced that Daniel would be stepping away from his duties effective immediately. No details. No dramatic statement. Just a quiet executive departure after 9 months of confidence, shortcutting, and explanations he thought were beneath him. Grant was not fired. That mattered to me. He was inexperienced, but he had not created the system failure. He had been placed in a role without training, authority, or support because Daniel wanted someone easier to control. The controller reassigned him to a real analyst position. He completed the Treasury training. He learned the process properly. And 6 months later, he became one of the strongest people on the finance team. That was the difference between someone making a mistake and someone building a culture where mistakes are inevitable. The bank restored Meridian's portal access on Wednesday afternoon, but not without conditions. Meridian had to enroll 3 active administrators, rotate every credential, complete a documented recovery test, implement dual approval for all administrator changes, and provide quarterly continuity reports for the next year. The CFO who said the process was too complicated had left behind 12 months of mandatory controls. The company had to pay outside consultants, bank fees, legal fees, and overtime to repair what he had dismissed. The total cost of the lockout was never shared publicly, but I saw the internal estimate. Just under $380,000. And that did not include the trust Meridian lost with its carriers. The CEO offered me my job back. Then she offered a promotion. Then she offered a retention package. I thanked her. And I declined. Because I had learned the most important lesson before that first call at 7:06 a.m. If a company only sees your value when you are gone, returning does not change what they believe. It only teaches them that they can lose you, panic, and buy you back. I did not want to be bought back. I wanted to be respected before the emergency. So I finished my consulting engagement. I trained the new Treasury team. I built the recovery procedures Daniel had rejected. I ran 3 access tests. I made sure every administrator had individual credentials, written authority, and actual practice using the system. Then I walked away. Not angry. Not loud. Just finished. 2 months later, I joined a smaller logistics company as Director of Treasury Controls. On my first day, the CEO asked me one question. If you disappeared tomorrow, could the team still pay everyone Friday? I smiled. That is exactly the question you should ask. If that hit you the way it hit me, hit subscribe. This channel is proof that being underestimated is a warning, not a weakness. Here is the lesson. Never let critical knowledge become invisible just because you are good at carrying it quietly. If you manage systems, payments, access, client records, or anything that can stop a business cold, document the process. Ask for backups. Ask for cross-training. Ask for recovery testing. Then ask in writing. Not because you are trying to make yourself replaceable overnight. Because a professional builds continuity, and a smart professional makes sure leadership cannot pretend they were never warned. Know your rights when you leave a job, too. Do not share credentials informally. Do not give away passwords over text. Do not access company systems after your authorization ends. If they need help, make sure the scope, payment, authority, and liability are documented before you touch anything. That protects the company. More importantly, it protects you. People like Daniel call controls bureaucracy until those controls disappear. Then they call it a crisis. Do not accept responsibility without authority. Do not accept urgency without written terms. And do not let someone turn their failure to plan into your obligation to rescue them for free. Being untouchable does not mean nobody can replace you. It means your work is documented, your boundaries are clear, and the truth about your contribution exists before someone tries to rewrite it. The next story began 3 weeks before my annual bonus was supposed to vest. My company suddenly said my role was being restructured, but the clients I managed had seen what was happening long before I did. They knew exactly why leadership wanted me gone, and when they found out who was replacing me, they made a decision that cost my former company far more than my bonus. Subscribe so you don't miss what happened when they wanted me gone before my bonus vested. So did the clients.